So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the discussion. My name is Jelani Cobb, and I'm the director of the Ira A. Lipman Center for Journalism and Civil and Human Rights at Columbia Journalism School. And we are very fortunate to be able to have this conversation tonight. Just by way of context, I am in Minneapolis right now. In fact, I'm here covering the trial and now subsequently covering the death of Dante Wright, which has happened in the midst of the trial. And just by happenstance, I'm in a building that is directly next door to the building where George Floyd died, the intersection with George Floyd. So, that's the kind of context that the conversation is happening in, where we're dealing with the fault lines of race, bigotry, bias, violence, the intersection of all these things, and how, as media, we can handle and cover and address these issues effectively and responsibly. And to help facilitate that conversation, I'm very happy to have with us a historian, colleague, and person who I admire in her work, the historian Ellen Wu, who is an associate professor of history and director of Asian American Studies at Indiana University, and the author of the book, The Color of Success, and also a forthcoming book, which is sounds to be very interesting just based on the title. It's called Overrepresented: The Surprising History of Asian Americans and Racial Justice. And we also have my colleague at the New Yorker and fellow staff writer, Jiayang Fu, who is a staff writer. As I mentioned, she's been a staff writer since 2016. And her work, particularly in the course of this upsurge, and certainly upsurge in visibility that we've seen directed at Asian Americans, has been instructive and essential. And she is also at work on a memoir called Motherland. So I think I just want to jump into this and start by asking, from your vantage points, how do we get to this moment? We've seen the increased violence directed at Asian Americans, and at the same time, increased visibility of that violence. So it's hard to understand even what the baseline was prior to this. And so unpack for me a little bit of what this moment entails and how we came to be here.
Okay, I'll jump in and I'll just start talking and see what happens.
I'm sorry, I should have specified. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thanks for that question, Jelani. I think it's really interesting when you say baseline. And so what this, I think in the last month, what that has really underscored in a lot of ways. So I do study Asian American history, right? And that's what I've been doing for the last 20 or 30 years, I think. And violence is such an integral part of that history. And that part of that history, I just think, is so surprising. It's just caught a lot of people by surprise. And so, but I don't necessarily think it's caught many Asian Americans by surprise, at least people who experience a lot of this in the day-to-day, which is, I would say, probably working people mostly, working class people, people in precarious situations, but also people that come from backgrounds where they've experienced, or their families have experienced, a lot of violence, where they came from. So I think, so what you're saying is correct in the sense that there's this tension between an invisibility, or this, I do think this feeling among Asian Americans, that the people I've talked to anyway, that people feel like their lives seem very inconsequential to others, right? And I think that gives that feeds into the that feeling of invisibility, right? That nobody else seems to care, but at the same time, that weirdness of being hyper visible, especially in that pandemic moment where, people just feel so self-conscious. I know I wasn't a mask wearer before the pandemic, and I did feel very self-conscious once I started doing that, last March, because of that. The way, at least in the town I live in, which is a college town, mask wearing has always been associated with, Chinese international students and, foreigners.
Jiayang, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, I do think that I've been thinking a lot about the violence of this moment and how it relates to racism and visibility and the deformed nature of American society when it comes to race relations kind of running through kind of every access that has led to this. And of course, I'm thinking of the Atlanta shootings and how invisible the primarily kind of older Asian women who were killed, how they were, and also how the invisibility of a lot of the elder Asian kind of victims of these racist attacks have been across America. But I've also been thinking about the systemic racism against Black Americans, that have almost kind of been at sort of the kind of egregious heart of American society, and that the visibility almost of that violence, but kind of the hyper visibility of this connection between African Americans and violence, and how these two minority groups, how they constitute kind of these invisible but also very visible axes of American society. And I think about how when it comes to, one thing that has really preoccupied me is how in this increasingly tense moment of racial reckoning, that a lot of the conversation becomes, well, kind of what is the responsibility, of Asian Americans and African Americans, and is there a tension between them? And oftentimes, I think, in that conversation, what gets left out is who the most empowered group who have formed kind of this very deformed racist dynamic in the US, which primarily have been white Americans. And I just it has led me to have a lot of uncomfortable conversations, but also think about kind of why it is that these conversations haven't been happening more frequently, and also why it kind of has led to why it is that when the violence occurs, a lot of the question becomes, well, what is the relationship between the African Americans and Asian Americans, and how have they contributed to this dynamic, and not really a probing of, well, who has been responsible for the racial hierarchy in America for the last many 300 years.
So I'm glad we kind of got here. This point about the context of it. So we've seen this discussion of violence, and I know, Ellen, you and I have had conversations about this previously, even earlier, before this kind of conversation started most recently. But can we talk a little bit about the history and the context of the violence that has been directed at people of Asian descent in this country?
Sure. Okay. So I think we can sort of think about that along two different sort of geographical maybe tracks. And so first, we could dial all the way back to really the middle of the 19th century, right? When Asian immigrants started to come to the United States in sizable numbers around the time of the gold rush and afterwards. And as you know, something that I really emphasize in my teaching is that white Americans did not always necessarily think of Asians as threatening, even our founding fathers before had some admiration, I think, for Chinese culture and Chinese things and so forth. But it was really in that mid to late 19th century period where, as workers of all kinds headed to the US West to, try to improve their lives, there was a lot of, there's all these kind of uncertainties and volatilities at the time, right? We have the Civil War and then the abolition of slavery and this moment where white Americans have to redefine for themselves what it means to be free, just as African Americans have to think about what it means to be free. But that is a question, I think, that preoccupies white workers, right? The idea of free labor. Meanwhile, you have then workers from China, and then also this sort of white sense of entitlement to the opportunities of the West, right? In that kind of settler colonialist way. So that by the 1860s and 1870s, as all these workers face economic uncertainty, there's a way in which white workers, a lot of them immigrants themselves, Irish and so forth, begin to understand a difference between themselves and the Chinese workers, and that difference they interpret as threatening to their own well-being, right? So there's this momentum building in terms of what to do about that, how to solve this problem of uncertainty, volatility, and well-being. And I think all these, and all of these anxieties kind of coalesce into this Chinese exclusion movement, which is political, of course. There's a lot of momentum for passing various types of laws to shut out Asians from any sort of meaningful participation in the economy and society. But certainly it also white folks express this hostility in terms of violence. And so, there's been great work done, most recently, I think, by historian Beth Lou Williams out of Princeton. But I think it's really pretty stunning to go back and look at that historical record of how, there were lynchings, arsons, shootings, and all kinds of, there's a great document I teach, and I'm happy to share it with your students if you like. It's a bilingual Chinese-English dictionary from the 1870s put out by the Wells Fargo Company. And I have my students read it because the kinds of phrases that the Chinese workers are looking to translate into English they're so violent. It's like, this person shot at me, this person tried to beat me or something. I think that it's such a revealing source about the daily violence that workers at that time face, right?
I mean, I think it's fascinating. Like when I talk with my students about this, we find this idea of belonging and who America is for coming up again and again in a way that explicitly and sometimes implicitly categorizes Black people and people of Asian descent in the same way, or juxtaposes them, always to the net benefit of a kind of white supremacist hierarchy. But all of us are familiar with Plessy v. Ferguson and what Plessy v. Ferguson did to the 14th Amendment. But we don't know, the Yikwo v. Hopkinson case, which is out of California, and is explicitly about those same principles, I guess like about a decade or so before, actually a little bit more before that, and is integral to understanding how the court wound up getting to Plessy, or the dissent in Plessy, which people have talked about, Judge Harlan's, John Marshall Harlan's dissent in Plessy, which there's an interesting dynamic in it, because I read that dissent first time in undergrad, and it's framed as this perfectly moral, indignant example of kind of American equality and idealism. Because in the dissent to the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, the Justice Harlan says that the Constitution is colorblind, that separate but equal is unconstitutional, that it fundamentally eviscerates the ideals of the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. I read that decision about 8 times probably, never actually realizing that I was reading an excerpt, because in the full decision, Harlan writes that we should definitely give Black people their rights, not the Chinese. Like, the Chinese are the problem. Black people are the ones we should give the rights to, which is a kind of direct, kind of compare and contrast idea of who deserves to be included within the democratic fold.
Yeah, and I think it's just worth remembering, right, that these are all the racial order, right, is something that has to keep being reproduced and rethought and then reconfigured, whether it's, you know, sometimes in its status quo, right? But another, you know, a lot of us Asian Americanists, we always you know, point to, you know, Frederick Douglass as one of definitely in the minority of voices who really advocated for allowing, you know, the Chinese to have access to naturalized citizenship and sort of the rights of belonging, right? And this is like in the 1860s, I think late 1860s or early 1870s. And so that is a really interesting moment to me, in the sense that there's just so much change happening in the United States, and racial and otherwise, and there's just all these moments, right? But we could maybe one more thing, and I'll stop here. We could return to this point, but it just made me also think about how important it is to understand the relationship between region and race, right? In terms of this part of Asian American history was so much about the politics of the West, you know, the West, and but then we think of like Plessy and Ferguson, and that history, we think of it so much as about the U.S. South. So I'm just going to put that out there, and maybe we can come back to it.
I would just like to jump in.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Just with one. I mean, you know, I think so much of, you know, as we've said, racism is, you know, is about the shape of power and who, and the way that power is distributed in a society. And I think one of the most effective, like insidiously effective aspects of American racism is that it almost forces the disempowered to police each other and to fight each other for what little power we have. And what I mean by that is, you know, this last year of the pandemic has made that so clear to me, as the pandemic has kind of elevated our anxiety about our mortality in every which way, and about the finite, you know, economic resources at our disposal, and as these kind of, you know, and that feeling of anxiety has kind of simmered to, you know, kind of this increase in just public violence, and it really affects, you know, it makes plain the way that minorities, you know, their sense of the narrowness of their lives and of the possibilities inherent in their American existence forces them not to reckon with the power hierarchy, you know, in its entirety, but what they feel they are entitled to, which is a very thin sliver, and that they feel the only people they can, you know, that they can fight for, what little power they think they are, owed, are the least, are those who have as little power as themselves, but who they feel are, their tribal rivals. And I find that enormously, heartbreaking, sociologically interesting, and I'm particularly interested in the way that dynamic is played out in this moment between Asian Americans and African Americans, and it's nothing new, like this has been happening in American society. But in this moment, as I'm talking, to Asian American friends, that anxiety unfortunately expresses itself in the worst kind of fearful, bigotry that is an expression of fear. And I think that is the effectiveness of American racism, that it's not it makes us become narrow in our visions, and it makes us choose false foes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is like a kind of fascinating redundancy in American history. And it's a redundancy, I think, because it is so effective in particular ways. And I always have said, when people say racism is stupid, I was like, well, if it was stupid, it wouldn't be around as long. I mean, it may be a stupid undertaking, but it is an extraordinarily well-engineered system.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the reason that we've been grappling with its implications. Our best scholars and humanitarians and activists and people devoting their entire lives to trying to dismantle a system that continues in some way. I want to talk about, because this is Columbia Journalism School, I want to talk about the way that some of these stories have been covered. I think I had been keeping track of some of the themes in these stories, but really I think Atlanta blew the doors off. Like, you just had to pay attention to all of what was happening there. And I wondered if you, both of you, could talk a little bit about the themes you've noticed in the coverage, what you think people tend to get wrong in these kinds of stories, and why.
This is the Atlanta shootings. I mean, I think that when you're talking about victims who have not been who are not accustomed to being in the American media limelight by any stretch of the imagination, there can be something that feels both artificial and vacuous about immediately putting them center stage. And I often think about what it means to grieve lives that we know so little about, and whether that grief, especially when in the aftermath of a public shooting, whether at what point that becomes theatrical, and what point that becomes a continuation of the dehumanization that was part of their killing in the first place. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, because, well, it's grief, I mean, how can there ever be anything wrong with grief? But I think, grief, you're mourning a life that's lost, but I think the question should be, how was that life lived? And how did that life acquire such marginalization in the American, imagination? And that question, I think, is it's more important to their humanization than, what a saint they were in their, when they lived, and putting them on somehow, on this pedestal of, the inviolably virtuous. And I think And I think when it comes to what struck me when it comes to Atlanta shootings was that immediately there was this urge to grieve, that lives have been lost, but there was very little really known about, how did these women live, and what was the dynamic between those who worked in the salon, in these massage parlors versus those who owned the massage parlors. What was the power dynamic there? And how did that affect the shape of their American dreams? And and that makes up the complexity of both their lives, on their own terms, and also their relationship to American society and the place that they came from. And I feel like, you do them the most justice when you're able to paint that fullest portrait. And right after, right after the killings, you felt this kind of immediate urge to almost to certainly express how tragic the circumstances were of their death. But there was this absence of, why are these women here, and what exactly were their roles, and how many of these massage parlor kind of almost senior citizen women are there, and that coverage was, to me, kind of most most symptomatic of the marginalization of these women's lives, because it becomes so clear that we know so little about them, and up until they were killed, we didn't really care about how they lived.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, I would agree totally with Jiayang, but I think that was part of how upset I felt, that where was everybody on March 15th, like, why right now? But I would just maybe to say something different, that your first point, Jiayang, was kind of interesting to me, right? When you talked about how these are people not used to being in the limelight. And I think I would say even just beyond the families and the communities of people immediately involved, I would say maybe just Asian American. I know that's a large group in general, right? So, I mean, I'm not a reporter, but I was certainly on the receiving end of a lot of calls from the media. And I know a lot of my colleagues who are scholars were as well. And, in some ways it was just a scramble, in the sense that, we're also not necessarily used to getting a lot of people contacting us or caring about our communities. And certainly, I heard from actually our mutual friend Deepa Iyer, right, who I remember she really reminded, I think sent out a reminder, tweeted out, just please make sure to center the voices of organizers and folks really on the ground. And I think that maybe probably was a challenge for the reporting, because for many outlets, I don't think, I just don't think these communities are high on the priority list. So that's something I hope we can, work on moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, just one, sorry, Jelani, I know you're probably, you're gonna move on, but just one more point. I thought I had this weird kind of moment of, I don't know, of like this jarring moment of an emotion that I don't even know how to put into words, when after the Atlanta shootings, I got many texts from people I wasn't even really in touch with about just they're expressing kind of deep feelings of just sympathy for what had happened in Atlanta. And it was so, and I remember hearing from my, from my African-American friends after the Floyd shooting, that they had gotten similar messages. And some of them, I mean, one friend told me that she got like $100, basically as almost restitution for being Black. And it was like, she didn't know how to respond to that. And I didn't get any money, but I got many kind of like these sympathy messages. And I gotta say, like, part of me felt grateful, because I think, well, they're acknowledging that this happened and this happened to my community, but it's also just, I don't know that other emotion is harder to completely to define. Like, I feel like, frankly, I feel uncomfortable and embarrassed, and and it makes you feel like, well, how much was I a part of this society to begin with? If like at the end of this mass, like if after a mass shooting or a murder, that like, you know, that requires, you know, a segment of my friends that feel so uncomfortable that they're, you know, sending that they're sending these messages. And it really reminded me of what a lot of my Black friends said after the, you know, Floyd shootings, after the Floyd shooting. And that discomfort is difficult to express, but I also feel like I have to kind of reckon with it a little bit. What does it mean to be a member of this society? And not even what to do with that, you know, with how to mourn together.
Right.
I think I want to add one quick thing for people. Like, we're going to open the chat in about 10 minutes for questions. So if you start formulating your questions now, so that when we open it, you can just you know, jump right in. But I want to go a little bit because I'm on 38th in Chicago, where George Floyd died. That I think that I've been struck by the way that we metabolize these incidents and the similarity in them. And it's almost as if, and I would add Me Too and as well, it's almost as if these kinds of dramatic incidents make people aware of questions that they had not considered previously. And the fact that they had not had to consider those questions previously highlights just how distinct those burdens had been and how segregated those burdens had been to the people who had been carrying them all along. With that as a segue, you know, Ellen, when we spoke maybe a week or so after the shootings in Atlanta, you talked a lot about the way that gender, and specifically the kind of categorization of women of Asian descent, fit into this narrative. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that now.
Oh, sure. I will say that, yeah, I'm trying to process everything you've been saying. I think I'm really grateful, actually. I really appreciate the people that did respond in a public way in the aftermath of the Atlanta tragedy. Many of those were people, I think, scholars and organizers who really do their work in a very intersectional way. So I felt really good about the fact that there was so much insistence that you cannot, and this was a question we would just get from reporters, right? Like, is it racism or is it sexism? And then everybody's just like, it's both, you know, it's both. And so I think that has been that training we have had, whether, you know, working in our communities or researching them or reporting on them, I think has been really invaluable. And kind of going back to what you said, Jelani, about, you know, some people, it's so, I think, and then the people just seem so surprised that you know, or just, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. It just, people hadn't thought of these things in this way, right? But that we have to keep insisting that you cannot separate those out, right? And also class. I think that the fact that this is a really this specific tragedy was very classed as well. So I guess I would say that I really much appreciate how people were able to respond with those points.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think the class component is definitely, you know, it was a huge part of the you know, the Atlanta, you know, shootings, kind of, you know, the way that these women were pursuing their American dreams. But I think the intersection of economic degradation and racism cannot be, you know, I think oftentimes has been obscured. And I think, you know, again, a lot of the power of racism comes from the fact that it takes away so much, you know, economic opportunities. And that can really, and poverty, or even, I mean, economic oppression can be corrosive to the sense of self that then makes you act out against others who you feel like you might stand a chance of exercising power over. And I think that leads to a lot of like the toxic dehumanization when it comes to how racist, in America, how race is, depicted, and how various, minority groups, frankly, regard, one another, but how that kind of, how racist tropes are, perpetuated. I think, the absence of economic opportunities as a result of racism can also dehumanize you. And unfortunately, that sort of like internal dehumanization finds expression in feelings of just desperation and frustration that then finds expression in violence. And I think that sometimes it's not, talked about enough.
I want to tell everyone that the chat is open now if they want to begin posting questions. I feel like it's pertinent because of what we've seen in the past week, where Tucker Carlson has gone full white supremacist replacement theory advocate. But I do want to ask how much of this is connected to not only COVID and the stereotyping, but also this bigger anxiety in America about demographics and immigration.
Yeah, I think immigration, at least when it comes, immigration, when it comes to, kind of the presence of Asian Americans in America, is, I think, a subject that so many of us, including me, I think, did not, really know enough about. And that the waves of immigration was a large part a result of, American policies crafted, for American kind of economic self-interest, which is fair, but you resulted in kind of waves that came for sometimes as refugees, other times as labor, other times as very high skilled labor. And what that manufactured this kind of very uneven hodgepodge of Asian Americans who in America are taken as this single kind of entity, as this single, as this group who should have a common affiliation. But Asian Americans, but it it contributes to this dynamic where some Asian Americans are often considered the highest earning minority group in this country, but they also have some of the highest poverty rates. So what do we do with that? And when you apply the model minority myth on that segment, for example, in New York City, where I live, Asian Americans have been having some of the highest poverty rates, and then I think they're doubly disadvantaged because they are assumed to be somehow more advantaged than others, and they are suffering, and they've been suffering from poverty and all the disadvantages that come from economic dispossession for some time now. So again, like I think we know so little about those trends of immigration, but they are they're integral to kind of to a lot of the misconceptions we have about Asian Americans right now.
Yeah. And I think I would just add to what Jiayang was saying that, if you track through time, even from the 19th century, I do think that in a lot of ways, the social standing of Asians in American society has a correlation, right, with the US relationships to their sending countries or their sending regions. And I think that obviously the most famous examples being World War II and the incarceration of Japanese Americans when the US was at war with Japan. We saw that, of course, in the aftermath of 9/11, when South Asians, Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, Sikh Americans, became racialized as quote unquote terrorists, and many of them suffered tremendously, state violence and then interpersonal hostility and violence. And I think for sure, the anxieties that the United States has had, especially in this period we're talking about with this newer immigration, is also a time when the United States has transitioned out of being an industrial economy to like what I would call a knowledge-based, service-based economy. And that has meant competition with, Japan. We think about the 70s and 80s, for instance, and then, China, right? The rising competition with China. So in a lot of ways, the status of Asian Americans just cannot be understood without thinking, globally and thinking trans-Pacifically.
Mm-hmm. We have a question. Those in power creating a system whereby other racial minorities end up going against each other is not uniquely American. If you look at history, I feel like it's human nature, unfortunately. What do you think is uniquely American in preventing non-whites from collaborating in changing oppression? Or do you think due to each tribe's history being so different, that is an impossibility?
Yeah,
I want to jump in on, I want just one quick thing on that as moderator premise. I don't think that the collaborative idea is an impossibility because we've seen, in many instances, the kind of overlap and interplay of these dynamics in ways that are complicated. So for instance, in my class earlier, actually, we were talking about two really important activists whose names have not been invoked enough, but Grace Lee Boggs and Yuri Kochiyama, both of whom were Asian American women who were integrally and deeply connected to Black freedom struggle movements in the 20th century. And notably, that image of Malcolm X, that terrible image of him as he died, people don't know that is Yuri Kochiyama holding his head. And so she was that integrally connected to these movements. Also, as Alan mentioned earlier, Frederick Douglass understood this when he gave that speech. I think it was 1866 when he gave the speech. And he makes the radical idea where people are saying Chinese could not ever become Americans. And he said, because they were too attached to their homeland. And he said, well, here's an amazing idea. After a while, America will be their homeland and they'll be attached here because they're actually human beings and they develop connections to the place where they live. And that's it, the crux of his argument for the humanity of people who he understood through the lens of having been deprived of his own humanity as an enslaved person. And so I think, and there are other examples we could kind of go through, but I don't think that this is never, as a matter of fact, a friend of mine who was working on a biography of Bruce Lee was talking about Bruce Lee's understanding and sympathy for the Black Power movement in the Bay Area, where he'd been located. And there are all these kind of like overlaps and interconnections, and then labor organizing. And we could have a whole conversation about this. So I don't think it's simply a long historical lineage of feuding tribalism.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there are. I mean, history has shown us that there have definitely been, fruitful, instances of collaboration, and of course, I don't mean to imply that this last year, I mean, kind of this rise in tensions means that we are inevitably heading toward, the kind of the failure of collaboration. But I do, two things come to mind. One is so much I think of, at least in Asian American communities. I mean, among newer immigrants, among those who already, I think, have a high level of anxiety about their place, I think they sometimes are reluctant and fearful of actually, meeting both white Americans and brown Americans, Black Americans. And I think so much of the fear and suspicion can be almost melted away through just more regular interaction as human beings. And I think that kind of needs to come at a community level. But on a more, and I think that there could be ways in which we can encourage that. But on a more kind of conceptual level, I oftentimes find myself asking at least my Asian American friends and especially newer immigrants, why we have to adhere to this existing racial hierarchy in which the white majority are in a strange way kind of seems most absent from the violence, but also are at least so many of the policies crafted by white Americans are the architects of a lot of the violence and the tensions that we have now. And why do we, I mean, for Asian Americans, I often ask, well, isn't it possible for us, even as newer immigrants, to remake the architecture and to give us to make room for other kinds of possibilities in kind of what America could be? And I know that sounds very conceptual and abstract, but I do think those questions are worth asking, especially for the future generation, especially as Asian Americans are set to be I think the fastest growing minority. And how whether I think they have a choice to make. I mean, do they continue trying to climb kind of this ladder in which that seems very color coded in the worst kind of most toxic way, or do they think about or do they try to remake it? And I think that's really those questions need to be asked in public, because I think the younger generation needs to hear that these are possibilities and that we are capable of kind of remaking, the status quo, and that it is that it really exists kind of in their hands as much as anything else.
Yeah, yeah. Can I just and I think this is a really important point, because sometimes I worry about the way that these issues people discuss these issues as if white supremacy is this like omnipotent, forever eternal actor, and then that just kind of renders everybody else like there's like no agency on the part of anybody else. So I do think obviously the power differential is great, as well as other kinds of material differentials or differentials of safety or dignity. But I think it is really, really important. And I think that's why the community level just matters so much. I think, Jelani, when you talked about Grace Lee Boggs, when I think of Grace, I think of the fact that she was a big proponent of food justice and, urban gardening, back before it was like trendy, and thinking about these local level changes, policy changes, but also just envisioning a different kind of community and the different ways to live, which are so important, and help us, as Jiayang saying, just imagine a different kind of future out of this, white supremacist nightmare, So,
yeah. I mean, I see this a question from Charlotte on the chat. I mean, can you speak to instances where even within Chinese communities and other groups, why there also appears to be intergroup hostilities? And again, I think that comes I mean, I think that comes back to the way in which, you know, anxiety about your place in the society and kind of the rules of the society that breeds those anxiety make you feel the most insecure about whether you belong to this place that you have chosen to call home. And you know, I always go back to Baldwin, and I think he talks, you know, and I think he talks so eloquently about the God, about the self-loathing that underlies so much of the violence that the African Americans of early generations have felt have done to themselves, but against each other, and also and I see that an echo of that so much in Asian American communities too. I mean, at the heart, I mean, when you don't feel like you belong in this society, when you don't feel like you have a place that in which you can feel like that is truly yours, I think you turn against yourself. And I think seeing those parallels between the Asian American, community now and African American, community, I mean, for generations, I think that can help for us to feel like we have so much more in common, and that we're actually so much more united kind of against the deformed nature of white supremacy, and it can help us, I think, to ward off those feelings that somehow it's our deficiencies that are causing preventing us from making progress in this society.
I want to jump in because we have 5 minutes left and kind of do like a succinct round of questions to see how many of these we can get in here. But David O has a question, which I think is important. It says, Professor Wu mentioned our invisibility in news coverage. What are the reasons newsrooms ignore us, and what would you like to see from news coverage? So if we can try to answer like our 30-second answer, we'll see how many of these we can get through before we have to wrap up. Does either of you want to respond to that?
So sorry.
Why there was not sufficient coverage of issues associated or of importance to Asian Americans even before all of this happened?
Yeah, my 30-second reply, I'm going to really try to keep it to 30 seconds, is that there probably needs to be more Asian Americans in newsrooms to kind of understand kind of the architecture of how Asian Americans feel kind of either kind of how they feel constricted along both economic and social axes, and covering those before they rise to the level of violence, I think is really important. And I think that requires having more Asian Americans in the newsroom to dig up those stories.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would just say over the last 7 or 8 years, almost 100, like nearly every reporter or journalist who's reached out to me has been Asian American or a reporter of color, almost always. So I think that is a lot to be said about the staffing of the newsroom.
That's a very familiar conversation to those of us here at Columbia. Jiayang said earlier that American racism makes us narrow in our visions. What are some of the systemic widespread changes you envision? I know that's a ridiculously big question to ask a short answer to.
Yeah, I mean, in my kind of like rapid fire response, I think it would be even starting kind of with our with our education system. I mean, I think this is already perhaps happening, but it took me until after college to learn about kind of a lot of the, the push for like how connected, the push for civil rights of African Americans, the exclusion of Asian Americans, the push for women's rights kind of in the earlier part of this country, how that's connected. And what I would really like to see kind of in the American education system is drawing those links about how, pushing for greater representation doesn't belong to it's not just a matter of one of that fight of one group, but really how those fights are connected and how they contribute to greater representation when it comes to power and to kind of this change in the distribution of power, how they can change the distribution of power in American society. Sorry, that's kind of my very kind of messy kind of 1 minute or 2 minute answer.
Yeah, I just have a very like mushy abstract, but I think a lot about just recalibrating our sense of values. There's this hashtag that went around that was like Asians are human, and it's like the most bizarre hashtag because it's like I think we see so clearly, what's happening in Minnesota right now that I can't believe we in this country we're not even at a baseline agreement that like everybody is human and entitled to live free of fear, free of being gunned down by the police, free of hunger, all these kinds of issues. So I don't know, I know that's very broad, but I would just really, is there some way we can get to at least that baseline agreement, right? That everybody is entitled to these basic levels of human dignity and a material well-being, I think.
Obviously, there's a lot more we could talk about, and I would love to even extend this conversation. I'm aware of the fact that I hijacked this room from a community organization about letting me use it. And so I really want to thank Ellen, and I really want to thank Jiayang for your time and your insight and wisdom on the subject. And thank you to everyone in the audience who has come and contributed questions. And also want to say thank you to Dolores Barkley for all of her work in making sure this happened. So thanks again. We'll look forward to Jiayang seeing your book when it reaches shelves. And Ellen will look forward to, if you have not already, you can get a copy of her book, The Color of Success, which is on shelves, and we'll look forward to her next project when that's ready for us as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jelani. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Jiayang. Thanks, Dolores, Stephanie, and Casey. Bye.